Welcome to this video, which will be probably about an hour, I reckon, by the time we get through the material I'm going to start introducing in a moment. I'm kind of coming back, I'm making a comeback somewhat to the world of content for a little while, because for the last 4 years I've been engaged in this research project, really, which is what I've been up to. And I've been doing a lot of research, actually, in a lot of different interconnected areas. But this area of education came across my radar in earnest in 2019. And at that time, a lot of nationalists were becoming quite interested in this area. It hadn't really become like this kind of mainstream issue yet. We were early to the kind of realization that this was centered around, institutions like the UN and the World Health Organization and UNESCO. And so a number of us wrote articles around that time. I wrote an article, I published it 2020, I think it was. And there was a March for Innocence around that time. And I thought that would be kind of it, I thought I would leave it at that. And my plan was to write one more article on this. And then after a month or two of researching that, a couple of months, that article, I wrote a good portion of it. And I wasn't happy with it. And this led me basically to kind of pursue this on a more structured and deep way. So that led me down to what you're seeing this evening, which is basically the introduction to a project that I'm calling the Globalist Education Series. Now, in order to kind of make this material kind of public, obviously things have changed in the last number of years. So I have a website called theirishnnationalist.com, and I haven't posted anything to that new since around that time, because I wanted to kind of focus on this. And that was the COVID years. There was a lot of people just talking about COVID at that time. And to be perfectly honest about it, I was focused on my project. I like to set long-term goals like this and to kind of pursue them doggedly. I don't really enjoy social media that much anyway. So for me, this was an opportunity really to kind of go to ground and just work on the research. And there's an awful lot of it to discuss. We're going to go from macro to the micro detail of what's going on here in Ireland and internationally, because as I found out, particularly in 2020 and from then onwards, this is an enormous paradigm that we're kind of looking at here, and there's many layers to it. There's many difficult questions that are going to be brought up throughout this series. I don't proclaim myself particularly to be an activist. I am genuinely intellectually curious about this area, and I think the questions I raise are fairly timeless questions in many respects. So, as you can see, I have a number of slides here, and we want to just work through these slides because, as you can see on the bottom right there, I have created a Substack called The Receipts. So I've updated my YouTube channel to be called The Receipts as well. And I've kind of decided to create a kind of a new brand around all this, because everything's just changed now, and Substack became this huge phenomenon. So I've created a Rumble and an Odyssey channel, which I'll have to update. And because I don't think YouTube is going to last that long, I think you should all be subscribed over there anyway. Because you never know when most of the people that I knew on YouTube from a couple of years ago are gone off YouTube now for a good few years. So if you could go to that and do that. And the format is I have written a number of long format essays that go into a lot of detail, and the first of them is published now for the last few weeks on this Substack, which I haven't told anyone about until tonight. And basically this introduces the project, and so this is what this presentation is I'm introducing the material in that essay. So some people may prefer that format. So let's give you some of the background. I originally published my article called "What is the United Nations Doing to Irish Education?" I believe it was called, which I have linked from the Substack there when you go look at it. And it covered the area of sustainable development, SDG 4 in particular, the Sustainable Development Goal 4. And we got into the UNESCO and WHO documents, which are the main kind of global advisory documents. They're advising on RSC, the Relationships and Sexuality Education Curriculum. And I also talked about the Council of Europe. It's good when you see people pick up, because some people picked up on some of that stuff. And there was other articles that were written around that time as well. And I see that they're basically getting rehashed now by a lot of people. And that's good, because there was good content in all of those articles. And a lot of the kind of newer people who've come to this area now, a lot of concerned parents, for example, have kind of come to this area. And there's a few groups who've been active for years beforehand. and they've really they've carried the ball forward publicly, and they've made this a public issue. So I tip the hat to them for doing that. This material should be of huge significance for them, and so it'll give you the background, and it'll hopefully give you a lot more insights when we get up to later developments. The ground I'll be covering in this kind of series really is this idea of a hidden curriculum. A lot of people have discussed this concept before in terms of education. Even from a left or a right wing kind of perspective, it's beyond kind of ideology in some respects. I think everyone can look at the modern education system and see that there is a kind of a hidden curriculum. There is a set of permanent assumptions that are made about human nature, and people point that out and criticize it quite frequently, including the modern critics of or the critical theorists. They point to different trends, or the queer theorists. They point to different things in education, and they say that it's informing certain attitudes by default or whatever. So I'll be discussing the ideological trends, and we're going to trace those trends all the way back to the classical period. We're going to talk about the philosophy of Plato. We're going to bring it forward to the Enlightenment. We're going to talk about the French sociologists, the Saint-Simonians. We're going to talk about the influence of Hegel and continental philosophy. And then we're going to get into how that kind of informs modern education as we know it today, via this kind of progressive ethos in education, which is kind of the background furniture to all of it, really. We'll be talking about concepts to do with social change, or managed social change, as I call it in that slide. And this is the idea that education is a core competency towards creating a new kind of society, or rebuilding society from the ground up kind of every generation. This will help us get a much deeper understanding of the objectives of modern education, which has an economic and a social aspect. Now, we'll be talking about United Nations instruments in later articles, and we're going to go deep on them as well. And we're going to give you some real insight into the thinking behind this. And we're going to talk about, of course, the ones relevant to RSC. So this is the philosophy that we're kind of dealing with here. It begins really in earnest with humanism, which comes out of the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment is associated with rationalism, and this idea of situating all knowledge on a kind of a rational basis, a denial of metaphysical philosophy, metaphysics. And it's a major departure. The Enlightenment was a major departure in terms of Western thought. And again, I'm not, in the article I stress, that I'm not merely a critic of the Enlightenment. There's things about the Enlightenment that I appreciate. And so the reason I think that I spent a lot of time really putting together these essays, because I wanted to give a fair appraisal of a lot of these areas. I think it's easy to kind of become an ideologue and to become dogmatic, and I've never really been fond of people who are ideologues. I've never been particularly ideological. I hold opinions, I hold views, but I would like to think that my opinions are reasonable and are open to adjustment, well, I suppose we all hope that, but I think I genuinely am, So we depart from the world, the kind of classical world, with the Enlightenment, and this is a major shift in Western consciousness. And this introduces the concept of evolution. Now, there's many philosophers have written about about the impact of the Enlightenment. I mean, one of my favorites would be René Guénon. I don't cite René Guénon in this series of essays, at least so far I haven't anyway. And but I do recommend that if you read someone like him, he will give you this much deeper insight into metaphysics and Western thought. And I think there's a tendency to equate the Enlightenment with us leaving some kind of dark age, and I think that's a very stupid kind of way of looking at things, a very incorrect way of looking at things. So we move into this with the Enlightenment. Eventually you get pretty quickly to this concept of evolution. So the Enlightenment introduces this notion of social change, and eventually you get biological evolutionary theories, and this belief in social progress comes from that. So progressive ideology is premised on the idea of social change and social progress. So progressive ideology has traditionally been associated with evolutionary theory and idealist philosophy. Now, this Enlightenment also gave us human rights, and it gave us, which is now a much more serious kind of and potentially dangerous kind of belief system, because human rights ideology suggests all kinds of things which it didn't suggest even 10 years ago. And so I discussed that in this introductory essay about, the significance of some of this, and this belief in equality, which has really come in earnest out of the Enlightenment, but in particular it has come from the revolutionary period following the Enlightenment. In particular, you go to the utopian period in the late 18th, early 19th century, and of course the French Revolution happens amongst all this kind of thought as well, this explosion of communistic kind of thought, utopian socialism. And of course the first sociologists come around at this time in France and places like this. And so we talk about all of that, and in the second essay I'll get into that in a lot more detail, and second and third essays. So this brings us to one of the guides that I think is a really useful guide on your journey here to discussing these subjects, is a man called Allan Bloom, who was a kind of a significant enough intellectual in his time. He's associated with neoconservatism. I'm not a neoconservative in any means, but at the same time, I do recognize that Allan Bloom actually was a pretty brilliant thinker, and his lectures, some of them are available on YouTube, and they're worth listening to. He's quite dynamic, and he first of all, he got a PhD in 1955, I believe. He studied under Leo Strauss at the University of Chicago, and he, as a classicist and philosopher, he is noted for translating Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Plato, both of whom are foundational theorists in terms of Western education, which we'll get into in the second essay in particular. Now, in 1987, he wrote this interesting book, which was a bestseller, a huge successful book called The Closing of the American Mind. And what's notable, actually I have it here, so that's what it looks like, The Closing of the American Mind. And that book in particular is one of the ones I really recommend people read, because when you read that book, you realize that Allan Bloom is described from his own experience, and he understands that the philosophy behind all this. He experiences what a lot of people now are describing as woke culture 30 years, 40 years before this was even a thing, And this is hugely relevant because there's a tendency, I think, in the modern kind of opposition movement to all of this that's going on, to assume that what is happening is somehow unique, that this is all a product of just current time, and if we can just go back to the 1990s, everything will be fine. It's just political correctness gone mad. That's what they used to say in the 1990s. There was PC gone mad, and of course, that's simply nonsense. That's escapism. That's just not true. This is a much kind of more consistent theme coming straight out of these earlier developments in Western civilization, and we'll explain how people like Rousseau and others, many others, have influenced this kind of development, even if they didn't necessarily mean to. In The Closing of the American Mind, basically he makes a number of points, and he makes a number of really good observations, first of all, about what the modern university is. And the university, and this is why I'm talking about the university, is explained here, because the university is the institution that makes everything possible. The university produces the intellectuals, the political class, the economic elites, the cultural elites, the artistic musicians, everything. Everyone basically pretty much has to go through the university to get credibility. The university, he describes it as the foundational institution of the Enlightenment, and it is. And he says it is the engine of liberal democracy, which is the political project of the Enlightenment. And it is premised originally on scientific rationalism and materialism and cosmopolitanism and atheism. And these values essentially are foundational to the university, and everything that flows from there starts with that kind of premise. And so he argues in that book, The Closing of the American Mind, that the university corrupted philosophy by basically linking it to the liberal democratic regime and power. And so I explain more in detail about that with quotes from Bloom in the essay. And I think it's a very kind of important kind of concept to get your head around, So it gives you more perspective. Bloom, first of all, was a philosopher in many institutions, and including the University of Chicago, where he got his PhD, I believe. while in Chicago, he witnessed how these continental philosophies were kind of creeping into the university, and he argued that America really wasn't sophisticated enough to kind of address and kind of offer any real resistance to this kind of thought kind of coming in the 50s. And so he witnessed it kind of take off, and this led, of course, then later to the civil rights thing, and of course the more radical kind of developments out of the civil rights movement in terms of race and gender politics. Now, he links these trends basically to the Enlightenment's combination of theory and practice to unleash human self-interest, which is basically the idea of the Enlightenment, is that human self-interest can be unleashed by the application of science to improve man. He argued that all of this basically corrupted philosophy, and it made philosophy just, it ceased to be the main kind of subject that we use to discern the truth and reality. And instead, philosophy became just another subject amongst many. And then you have the rise of economics, the social sciences, where man is kind of dehumanized. And he argued that the effects of this was that the tendency towards having ideological and scientific fads. So you have these kinds of trends. Now, I would argue that really what he's getting at there is things like feminism and all the different waves of feminism, queer theory, critical race theory, post-colonial theory, black studies, whatever it is. These kinds of, women's studies, these kinds of subjects really are a form of activism. They are not really a form of genuine inquiry. And so that what tends to happen, and a lot of people have commented on this, is that these kinds of subjects basically are constructed to kind of drive social change and to formulate attitudes of the adherents and turn them into activists. And so he said that the students that he witnessed he's talking in the 50s, they enter the university with moral relativism in the 60s. They enter with this attitude of moral relativism, and they have this kind of, these hardened opinions and this general kind of belief in principles like equality and openness. Now, of course, equality can be dangerous, because what is equality? Is there really such thing as equality? In what way are we equal? I mean, this is a very grave assumption to make in many respects. And then this idea of openness. Well, if you're too open, you can sometimes believe anything. If you're too open, you can have a lot of harm done to you because you're very naive. So just simply being open to evil is not good. So he questions a lot of this, and he said that the students he was encountering in this period in the 60s and everything, they couldn't basically defend any of these views in any intellectual sense, and that they basically weren't doing the reading that was required. They weren't really engaging with the great thinkers. And so Bloom was an advocate basically of what's called great books education, which is that there should be less emphasis upon academic institutions, and there should be much more emphasis upon people actually engaging with the great minds of history. And that was actually popularized out of Chicago as well. But we'll get into that in another essay later on. But, and this was kind of became some of the opposition to the progressives in many respects, was the people, and Bloom kind of took on that kind of attitude. And a lot of the critics that you'll find of this progressive type education, this collectivist type education, basically took that attitude that we need to get back to the great books, get back to the classic philosophy and work your way forward. And obviously discuss these ideas with other people, but learn to develop a sense of connection to these things so that they become real and they're not just an artifact. They're, because I think a lot of people would agree with this, that, there does seem to be, I'm told, that there is this major lack of reading comprehension that has come about increasingly over the last few decades. And it's like people aren't really doing the work in universities in some respects. A lot of the students are not really doing the work, but they're very politicized. And so I think you can see this in society. I think you can see it in the political radicals who now are directing our society, for example. I think a lot of them are very radicalized, and yet I don't think they have very much premise. I don't think they have ever been challenged in any serious way to defend their views in light of other arguments, And I think they almost feel offended when people ask them a question about it, This brings us to an interesting summary of Bloom's time in Chicago. So This is a quote from a Britannica article actually written about Allan Bloom, and it kind of summarizes some of his experience in which he talks about in The Closing of the American Mind. And he says, this article says, in 1969, a group of students took control of the Cornell's administration building and demanded that certain mandatory classes be dropped in favour of those deemed more, quote, relevant to them. After the university yielded to their demands, Bloom tendered his resignation, and so he was very angry about this. And in 1979, he returned to the University of Chicago. In The Closing of the American Mind, Bloom argued that universities no longer taught students how to think, and that students, especially those attending the top schools, were unconcerned about the lessons of the past or about examining ideas in a historical context. This is a huge thing with all critical theories, and essentially it comes out of the progressive way of looking at history, which is that history is a lesson that should be looked at from our time, and we should basically pass judgment and seek to look at the past from our perspective only. So his blistering critique, which offered no solutions to the crisis in education, blamed misguided curricula, rock music, television, and academic elitism for the spiritual impoverishment of students. Now that's a bit simplistic, but all of that is kind of true. I mean, he talks about rock music, he talks about movies and culture being lowbrow, basically, which was a frequent kind of hobby horse for the neoconservatives. I wouldn't say it's fully true that he offers no solutions. I think he's basically describing the great books kind of approach to education, which is unpopular with a lot of academic institutions, it seems. And I think that's because it basically takes a lot of the power out of the institution to basically formulate your opinions on how you should read texts. And instead it puts the onus upon you to really become a kind of an independent mind. So this brings us then to the evolution of education. Since this period, basically since the 60s and 70s, you have a transformation really in the role of what a school teacher is. So the teacher becomes what's called a facilitator. Now, if you've ever been involved in any kind of business or meeting or whatever, public meeting, I mean the meetings over immigration all over the country are a classic example of facilitation. So there is someone that is charged with directing the meeting or the group, and whether people in the group like it or not, which is actually much better if they don't realize this, but the facilitator has an enormous amount of power to color how the meeting goes. And so they will particularly if they generally have an idea in their mind of where they want to bring things. So the teacher in the classroom has a lot of power over the student. And so if the teacher is politicized, the teacher can basically extend a lot of their attitudes and mold the students to the way that they would like them to be. I'll talk about this a lot more later and how this kind of came about and the theorists behind this, and I'll talk about its influence in education. And so you have two distinct kind of objectives come out of the Enlightenment for education and the progressive era for education. One of them being education for economic ends. So a lot of progressives will even critique this, and they'll say that education shouldn't be just about economics, and I would agree with them. I think there has to be a level of education for economic ends, but I think a lot of people confuse education for technical training or for economic purposes as kind of the same as a kind of a true liberal education. And then, of course, you have education for social change, which the progressives are really into. They love this concept of social change, which is the objective of progressive ideology. And so this is rooted in utopianism. We'll talk a lot about utopianism over the coming several essays, because utopianism really was one of the foundational things that the early pre-progressive educator theorists like Rousseau kind of had. They had a lot of utopianism in them. And we'll talk all about that. And then, of course, you get to progressive ideology, and which I believe is quite close to being a kind of a religious kind of belief system in many respects. Basically, what you have with this kind of utopianism, I believe, is, and I'll go into depth in this in the second essay, is that essentially the kind of religiosity of the West is kind of transmogrified into these secular crusades. And these secular crusades have happened for, throughout the Enlightenment, really, and a lot of it you would agree with, a lot of it you would feel that was a good thing, and you could imagine yourself being part of it. But secular crusades can be dangerous too, and any crusade can be dangerous. And I think what we're dealing with in the West right now is a kind of a religious impulse that is basically being channeled into these causes, and it makes people feel very good to have a cause, And so that'll bring us to discussing Anglo-American Puritanism, because America became very, very important in terms of this progressive education that was kind of constructed. In particularly, it was put together in the late 19th century. And I'll have a whole essay on that later on. So the 20th century trends basically then that you have, so that bring about this kind of new paradigm that we're kind of living through. So you have the Gilded Age, and you have the rise of progressivism. And progressivism was very much very ambitious. It was a type of, it was absolutely, it had this economic utilitarian type of mindset, which comes straight out of the British utilitarians like Bentham and all these guys, and they in turn kind of influenced in some respects the utopians. And this generally was aligned with a kind of a pursuit of world government, interestingly, which is another aspect of this whole kind of system that we're going to be talking about, which people pick up on a lot. They can pick it up, they can see it with the UN. It's very clear that it's happening with the UN, and a lot of people talk about it, but it's very difficult sometimes to pull it all together in a kind of a coherent way. So I'm going to try and do that over the coming articles in more and more, and we'll just build a case as we go along. And maybe it'll be a few videos in between each article to go into more material. I haven't fully decided yet. But essentially then, this kind of leads to the establishment of the United Nations after World War II. And out of that you get UNESCO and the World Health Organization. UNESCO deals with culture and education and science. And the World Health Organization deals with health. And there's a kind of a story in terms of how we got there, which I'll talk about in the next slide. So progressivism and communism, basically in the mid of the 20th century, or really in the early 20th century, really, progressivism and communism are largely the main global ideologies. Okay, so National Socialism in Germany was kind of only there for about 10 or so years. Progressivism and communism basically aligned in some respects, and many of the progressives in the West were very fond of the Soviet Union. And there's a lot of reasons for why they were. And, you know, we could list all of these people who've gone to the Soviet Union. George Bernard Shaw, the Webbs from the Fabian Society, and John Dewey, and people, these progressive educators, people like that, they went to the Soviet Union, and they were very, in varying times, some of them more principled than others. They celebrated a lot of what they saw. Many of them came to distance themselves. Some of them didn't really. But they did pick up that there was a lot happening in Soviet communism that was very similar to progressive ideology. And this is a concept that I actually think is very important to understanding the mindset of Western progressives. And that is that they genuinely are looking to create a kind of an integrated world system. And that makes, and it's premised upon economics, and it's premised upon social science and psychology and soft sciences like that, which basically are used to manipulate people, to change their attitudes. And this is foundational, basically, to the progressive worldview. And essentially then, you get this, out of progressivism, you get this concept of social control, which was originally coined, I think, sometime around 1910 by this guy called Aylesworth Ross, who was a progressive. And anyway, that concept basically means, how do you exercise control over society in the absence of traditional institutions? That's basically what he's talking about. He wrote a book called Social Control. Along with that then comes technocracy, and technocracy arrives at places like Columbia University. I know Patrick Wood has written about this extensively. And technocracy is essentially this kind of managerial kind of society where we manage things based on managing resources, and there should be an authority in charge of everything, and that should be the experts. The experts should trust the experts, you know. So the progressives then, out of all of that optimism, in the 1950s, they find themselves basically creating the first development strategies, all of which are premised on progressive ideology and progressive assumptions about development and about how they can drive global development. At this time then saw the emergence of the economist as a social planner. So up until this time, economists were not really kind of a serious science. You know, they certainly were rarely ever consulted by governments. And it was only around the 1950s that this really started to change, and then you get the development of GDP and all these kinds of metrics. And once GDP and GNP become these kinds of means of measuring, you know, something in society, measuring economic output or whatever, then all of a sudden it becomes scientific. And now you can trust it, you know. And so I would argue that the development of GNP, GDP kind of measurement, and the solidification of standards like that have actually had an enormous impact on how we view our society. I mean, if you look at Irish society, we essentially, all we get is a litany of, oh, the GNP, the GDP looks amazing, you know. And really, the insanity of the calculation is in, you know, how it, and it kind of obfuscates more than it kind of shows in many respects. So you get this kind of social engineering to create this kind of new society. You get this kind of social engineering and these experiments in how to kind of produce the ideal citizen and the ideal consumer. And so you get the civil rights movement then after that period, and that is driven almost entirely by elites and idealistic college students, basically, more of whom are now in university and who have been admitted to university. And so the universities become really, really radical kind of sanctuaries. The civil rights movement turns into the New Left, and the New Left arrive in the 60s, and you know, they last for a couple of years, and you know, there's still a few of them around. I mean, I think a lot of baby boomers still have a lot of New Left policies, which are ideas, which would be kind of hostility to NATO. Some of them would be still, but they would be very much into this kind of social liberation kind of idea, even if they kind of don't directly espouse communism. But at the time, they would have espoused. A lot of them would have espoused they used to shout, you know, during the generation of 68 with all the protests and all, they used to shout about Mao, Marx and Marcuse, the Frankfurt School theorist. So the New Left splintered then into these kinds of smaller little movements of anti-racism, ecology, the various waves of feminism, gay liberation, third world liberation, and all the different black studies, all the rest of it. Women's studies kind of come out of all of that very quickly in the 70s. And then, of course, you get the emergence of a new model for development. So a lot of these students were more radical than the people who had created, the progressives who had created the earlier development strategies, which were kind of, which were viewed now as being paternalistic or, you know, a Western imperial imposition upon the oppressed minorities of the developing world. These narratives are everywhere, really. So, you know, the West is kind of blamed for kind of trying to extend economic development to these other countries. So on the one hand, they complain about not having economic development. As soon as they get aid or economic development support, then it's a Western colonial imposition. So you can't win, basically. This is kind of like a Marxian kind of trap. You know, like the Leninists, they've historically railed against the influence of the West. And it's all about enslaving these people. You know, we always get this stuff about, well, we're enslaving the West and is enslaving these countries in debt. And I think that's very much a Marxist kind of narrative, really. And it's an easy narrative to make. You know, it's easy to kind of sit there and kind of throw that kind of argument around. And I think, again, that's an argument that really puts a lot of people on the wrong path when it comes to looking at these things. Now, we'll talk more about that, of course. But, you know, what kind of happens then as this kind of social and economic radicalism is going on in the universities, and you get these development strategies, and the younger people who are coming into these new NGOs and everything are getting radicalized, and they're trying to push these things even more in a radical direction. So, and while this is happening, Western economies are generally being more and more deindustrialized. Now, this is particularly true in the case of America. Not really true in the case of Ireland, because Ireland we were so far behind in terms of economic development at this time. But there was, this kind of radicalism was present on some of the campuses, you know, in Ireland as well. And a lot of those people joined parties like the Labour Party, etc. You know, there's a few Irish politicians who would have been very active around that time. And of course, Sinn Féin picked up a lot of this kind of human rights, New Left kind of politics as well. And I think that's the source of a lot of their kind of transformation in recent years. I think people just didn't understand where they were and what they were getting inspired by. So the financial services kind of sector and the state sector explode. That's very true in the case of Ireland, actually, in recent years, is that you have this explosion of financialization, and the government grows, the state grows, and essentially you get quangos, and this kind of new kind of bureaucratic structure is created, and they're all, you know, paid quite well relative to other people, you know, who don't have those kinds of protections. And of course, multiculturalism is pursued, while increasing the level of competition for jobs, you know, and this has really been apparent in the West for the last 20 or 30 years. And so the left wing have become middle class culture warriors, and they have abandoned essentially this white working class, which would have been their traditional base. This is kind of an American progressive ideology in many respects. So I would say, rather than the kind of shitlib Irish progressives or leftists you see on, or liberals they call them sometimes, who are in these bubbles and they don't really kind of have much of a philosophy that you can kind of tear apart. It does seem to basically just, to me, it just seems like American progressive ideology. And I'll talk about that in a moment. And this is kind of spread globally now. So there's a new class of people associated with this. So there's a greater wealth disparity that comes out of this. There's a lot of ivory towers, people living in academic ivory towers, in not used to being critiqued, not used to being challenged, and used to being able to indoctrinate people, really, and coming out of university quite naive, really, into the ways of the world. What is embedded in these students and in the universities, from the universities, is this desire to transform the world. So there's an absolute nascent desire to transform the world, and you can see that today. A lot of people who are talking about education right now, they're talking about critical theory, they're talking about the LGBT queer theory stuff, and they're realizing that it's related to development, and they're realizing that it's related to this kind of period in the 60s and 70s, and they're correct. Now, I'm going to show that I think this is a deeper kind of change, and it comes from a more significant philosophical change over time. So, and then of course you get things like social impact investment come along in the 80s and 90s and 2000s, and we're now living in the peak of that, where you get these like institutions which basically create startups which are purely designed to drive some kind of social change. And again, they provide employment for this new class of social engineer slash academic slash activist. And it's very hard sometimes to work out what these people are. They kind of have a lot of hats on. But mainly what they are is they are looking to transform the world. You know, this brings me to an interesting book which appeared a few years ago by Christopher Caldwell, who was another one of these Claremont kind of people, these neocon kind of people. But his book impressed me because of how hard he went on this whole area of human rights, and in particular the civil rights movement in America, because really it's a critique of that. And he's basically kind of looking at the fallout of all of that now, kind of with 40 or 50 years of experience. And he's pointing out how this, like the whole woke thing basically was going on much longer. And we have to be honest about, I believe, tearing down a lot of this and just re-establishing a basis for civilization in which we can thrive as people. So it was called The Age of Entitlement, and I just have an interesting quote from it here. I quote a little bit from him in that article, that first article that's on my Substack. And he says, "The two elite projects that caused the most institutional upheaval at the start of the 21st century, diversity and digitization, were hatched, headquartered and run in universities. There was affinity between them. Computers looked like the solution to many problems of intolerance and inequity. The algorithms they ran on were neutral and dispassionate. They couldn't be taught to hate like the flag-waving men who drove 18-wheelers or the paranoid housewives who sat on school boards in Kansas." And the point he makes there is that there is this connection between progressive Silicon Valley type corporations and this diversity agenda. You know, so digitization and diversity do go hand in hand. And in Ireland, there's a major link, I think, between, a lot of people have pointed this out, obviously I haven't come with this, but a lot of people have pointed out that there is this major link between Ireland being marketed and trying to appeal to these kinds of people, and the changes that have occurred culturally in the country. And that's a theme we'll talk about more extensively later on in the series. But I thought it's a good book, and I'm impressed with how hard he went for a kind of a mainstream enough kind of guy. You know, like that would be a book that I think I would have been happy to write it. You know, so in 1990s Ireland, then our country becomes like this. We actually take on this kind of progressive type politics. And what was going on in the 1990s was you had this third way movement associated with Tony Blair, which I've investigated that a lot, and eventually I'm going to do a more deep discussion on this. And that was paralleled in America by this new democratic kind of movement, it was called, in America, and that was centered around Bill Clinton. And these were the trendy leaders of the post Berlin Wall West. And everything was so optimistic. Everything was so optimistic. Everyone was full of optimism, and there was the beginnings of this economic kind of growth. Blair inherited a pretty good economy from Thatcher. A lot of things had been restructured, and so on. So a lot of the dirty work had been done for Blair in England, basically. And he inherited a lot of this. And of course, one of the things that the Blair government did is that because they were social radicals and they're very sophisticated how they operate, they understood when they went in how to transform institutions. And it is from their experience in places like London Council in the 80s, where they were, they were initiating all these different programs to do with diversity officers and all this kind of stuff. And Clinton was very similar. He was quite more, although he had to be more careful because of the more kind of right-wing kind of nature of American, there's a different kind of political dynamic in Britain than in America. But Clinton was also like that. In Ireland, we had the equivalent of that when Mary Robinson became president, because very quickly the presidency became this kind of activist pulpit, which it has remained ever since, in my opinion. I mean, since Robinson, basically, then we had Mary McAleese, and it's all this very symbolic kind of progressive kind of position now, and it's essentially, I believe it is very deliberately controlled by the progressives, because that is kind of the peak, that is seen as the representation of Ireland, And Higgins is a very radical person. He's a huge fan of Gramsci, of the New Left radicals. He is quite pro-communist in some respects, and he is a radical. He is a radical, and he introduced a lot of this kind of trendy continental, Frankfurt Schools material into his. I understand it anyway, as I understand it, into his lectures when he was lecturing in college. And I've read a number of books referencing him, and a lot of them point this out, like that he's worthy of discussion, and the people around him, and so the presidency in Ireland became the embodiment of this. And of course, Irish governments became very much about, give away budgets, Ireland went in with the Maastricht Treaty. The European Union was formed, as we now pretty much know it, although we hadn't had Nice and Lisbon yet. And essentially, Ireland began receiving a lot of structural funds during the 80s, and that absolutely revolutionized our society in so many respects. And it allowed for these progressives and leftists generally to basically take up very viable career paths, directly responsible for while directly influencing the direction of our society. And we're dealing with the consequence of that now, because we now have an army of these kinds of people who have a lot of power in our society, and they're getting paid quite handsomely to alter our values. So this period saw the increasingly this kind of new civil rights radicalism became, Caldwell calls it a new constitution, and it really is, because Ireland has been put through a slew of referenda since this time, and there wasn't very much public outcry for these referenda. They were always driven by elites, legal elites. So a lot of the what you call woke or PC kind of culture, a lot of it basically was constructed in legal studies. It was constructed through legal scholarship, and that's why it's so dangerous, because it actually comes out of the institutions, the universities and their departments dedicated to the maintenance of Western law. And that is the case with critical race theory and all the rest of it. So in Ireland then you had, and in the West, you have this deconstruction of natural law for this new human rights regime. And it's very intolerant, and you have this new progressive institutional elite. And so when you look at how the law is administered in Ireland now, essentially, you have a lot of free legal aid is given via various institutions to people, for example, asylum seekers, and what they consider, minority or vulnerable groups. And the rest of us have to basically, we don't really have any rights in this regime except to uphold their rights. So if you're ever in any kind of dispute with someone of one of these dedicated minorities, essentially, then you become essentially the person who is supposed to have something taken from you in order to realize their rights. And so you had the rise of Davos Man, This is the archetypal. Bertie Ahern would be the archetypal Davos man. I remember the papers used to always talk about Davos man, and they used to be laughing at Bertie Ahern and all going out to Davos. They used to be making fun of his suits in the paper. And then funnily enough, around 4 or 5 years ago, they stopped talking about Davos man in particular, and then it became a conspiracy theory. But the Celtic Tiger was roaring, and Ireland was getting very, on the surface of it, Ireland was becoming a wealthy country. And so there's this kind of illusion of wealth in many respects. And there's also a growing dependence on foreign aid, and not foreign aid, foreign direct investment, and these big corporations from America, particularly ones associated with communications and computer technology, digitization and diversity. And this kind of creates this perfect storm of institutional kind of Gombianism and opportunism, and you've the creation of this kind of new NGO class charged with administering this human rights regime. And you have massive public spending increases, the trade unions, the NGOs, they all now make up what I call a Praetorian Guard, basically, around the establishment, progressive ruling elite. And that is why it is very hard to uproot them, because even if you, as a patriotic type person, or a nationalist or a conservative or something like, of some kind of variant of that, as you try to interact with the political process, you find that, we're getting protested by a coalition of trade unions and NGOs, all of whom are essentially parasites on society. And you find that no matter what you do, there is a guaranteed voting bloc that has been constructed for the establishment parties, with which essentially it's pretty much impossible to break it down, because they are paid from this kind of structure. They rely on this structure for their position of social standing and economic dependence. So they're not going to change. And this really began in earnest, I think, with Fianna Fáil, I think in the 80s and 90s, particularly with Ahern and all. And I think the Labour Party are very close to that. They were in a number of governments. And what they have done is that they have created this guard of progressives around everything. And essentially then, as a kind of an opposition to that, you are starting with a huge amount of the electorate basically off, that will not vote for you, basically, So I assume this was very clever planning. And so you get this, and as this is happening, Ireland is creating its first diversity strategies, and we're basically being told that Ireland is now a multicultural country. And so paradoxically, Ireland now becomes a magnet for mainly welfare tourism, to be fair, but we get this whole kind of mass immigration paradigm. So you get this blend of skilled immigration, mainly unskilled immigration, and the idea is that because we have created this enormous public liability cost, we have to basically bring in a younger population in the working demographic in order to keep it going. And because then everything inflates in cost, then regular people with regular jobs, their money doesn't go very far, so you get this phenomenon where we have now, where people can't afford homes. So this kind of goes hand in hand with a social paradigm. So here we are then. So education since the 60s. So progressive education basically comes out of the late 19th and early 20th century. It's a global movement and derived from, I would say, Plato, the Enlightenment, and continental philosophy, in particularly Rousseau, and later the German idealism informs it quite a lot as well, which we'll talk about later and in another essay. And with this global movement, you get this kind of spread of American managerialism, which occurs via the Marshall Plan initially, and that leads to the creation of all these different management institutes and all this. And essentially then the OECD is created under Kennedy, I think in 1960 or 61, and Ireland is part of that, of course. And then the OECD played a huge role in Irish education, which I have written an article about, and I'm going to get that out in a few months when it comes up in the timeline of how we're kind of working through this, and I have to finish it as well. And you get this kind of humanistic education then comes around in the 60s and 70s, and this is premised on humanistic psychology, and this is hugely relevant to this whole idea of facilitation, group work, values versus morality. So there's no hard and fast values. Now everything is relevant or relative. Everything is relative, and values need to be chosen. And so this leads you to a world of relativism and facilitation. Now, an interesting point to bring up in relation to NGOs and to this approach to education is that it's very much premised upon evolutionary theory. And so eugenics initially kind of traces itself directly back to Darwin and Malthus, and of course the Huxleys and Herbert Spencer and people like that. T.H. Huxley, known as Darwin's bulldog, and of the famous Huxley clan, who we'll talk about another member of them in a minute. And you get this idea of overpopulation, and the Earth's resources are finite, and we have to basically manage resources for the benefit of the greater humanity, which is kind of related to British utilitarian philosophy. And then you get this antinatalist culture. Now, I believe this is the main kind of source of this antinatalist kind of culture in the West in many respects. And we are plagued with this now because our birth rates are in decline, and we are in societies which don't really value children. We look at children as like requiring special care. And another time we'll get into this, but I believe that paradigm created this problem of fertility in the West in many respects. And so this brings us to a woman called Margaret Sanger. Many of you will know who she is. She was involved, one of the main orchestrators of the population control movement. She got a lot of support from the Rockefeller family and etc. But basically, she wrote this book called Woman in the New Race in 1920. In 1921, she founded the American Birth Control League. I think that was in New York, and she endorsed the 1927 Book versus Bell decision, in which the US Supreme Court ruled that states could forcibly sterilize people deemed unfit without their consent and sometimes without their knowledge. There was this thing called the Negro Project to get more blacks to be sterilized and to use contraception, etc. But of course, and she was quite a fan of Hitler as well at the time, and it kind of speaks to how progressivism and communism and even National Socialism have kind of this overlapping kind of modernist kind of aspect to them, and it's kind of a dehumanizing aspect in many respects. And so the point being that eugenics basically started out in with these kinds of evolutionary biological type basis. So, and interestingly, one of the reasons I'm bringing her up is so she organized with Edith Howe Martin, who was one of her closest kind of collaborators. She was English, I believe, and they organized the 1927 World Population Conference in Geneva. And one of the books actually where I learned about this, I was put onto this book by a friend of mine who's been helping me kind of with some aspects of this as I've been kind of writing all this. And this is this book called Fatal Misconception by Matthew Connolly. And that book is really good. It's really well put together, and it basically explains the whole population control movement and explains this shift from the old kind of paradigm of biological eugenics towards this kind of new paradigm, which we'll talk about in a second. So Sanger was very much involved with the progressive movement. She had the support of all these notable progressives like Bertrand Russell, W.E.B. Du Bois, and Julian Huxley. This kind of led to the development of reform or covert eugenics, that was what it was called. So at the 1927 conference, basically what they did was they basically hammered out a kind of an agenda, a global agenda, with how they would kind of pursue this, because you did have massive population explosion in the developing world, and I don't even know if it was called that at the time, but regardless, countries like India, China, and so on, they were basically encouraged to lower their population via numerous methods. Contraception was developed around this time, the early contraception methods, and a lot of sterilization occurred. There was a lot of outrages, and a lot of this has been written about. I'm not here to demonize Margaret Sanger. There's enough people to do that. I'm merely bringing her up because I'm using her to articulate she's kind of a person whose life basically spans this very important period. She's a very significant person, and she articulates to us that we shouldn't simplify ideologically, and we should always look to the ideas themselves and how similar ideas are expressed in different ideologies, and how this new paradigm kind of emerged out of this kind of new progressive movement. It created a new form of eugenics, and this reform or covert eugenics basically then was premised upon public health and nutrition projects. and programs. And this basically then was aligned with the promotion of contraception, sterilization, and this idea of women's health. And so that paradigm is still with us. We're still in this paradigm. Eugenics is still a part of our world. I know Edward Dutton I think he's arguing something like that. I completely agree, and I've come at that conclusion based on my own quiet investigation into all of this, and I've become absolutely convinced that progressives are completely eugenicists. They just are in denial about it, and they use other terms to mask what the eugenic policies are. But the promotion of contraception, of sterilization, all of this stuff, health and nutrition, this is a form of eugenics. And I'm not even saying all of it's bad. I'm not here to judge you. Like I say, I don't like judgment. I'm just trying to point out where the ideas come from. And aligned with this kind of population control movement, so the idea of a population control, of a population or a world population policy, basically provides an avenue to a world government. And so all global policies would require a global institution to administer them. And that brings us then to some of her friends. So Sanger's, she had so many friends. She was a networker basically, and one of her close friends was a guy called Havelock Ellis, and she wrote the intro to one of his books. He wrote the intro to one of her books. I think it was that book I just mentioned. I think he writes the introduction to it for her, or the preface. And essentially he was in the Fabian Society, and he was in the pre-Fabian Society, which was called the Fellowship of the New Life, out of which the Fabian Society came out of. There's an interesting book written by Frank Podmore of the Fabian Society, which explains how the Fabian Society originated in the Fellowship of the New Life, which was much more related to a philosophy club, and which discussed kind of a lot of cyclical research, all kinds of it was a funny time, the 19th century. There was a lot of overlap. There was a lot of interest in mysticism and this kind of thing. And I think as people became more secular, they kind of gravitated towards these kinds of the occult and all this kind of stuff. But the Fellowship of the New Life is an interesting institution. There's not much written on it really, but regardless, Ellis was in it, and it articulates really the point, which is that people like Ellis are progressives. They're associated with kind of new kind of concepts that are getting introduced in the wake of secularism and modernism and progressive ideology, and this kind of flows into this overall agenda of social reform, and sex education is a part of this. So Ellis was created along with sexologist Magnus Hirschfeld, who was German. He was a German Jew, I believe. And the two of them were in this thing called the World League for Sexual Reform. And the World League of Sexual Reform was written about in a book called Science in the Bedroom, A History of Sex Research, from which I now quote, written by a guy called Vern L. Bullock. You can find that on archive.org. And it says, the agenda of this group was advocacy of sexual education, sexual equality of men and women, reform of marriage and divorce laws, encouragement of contraception and birth control, reformation of the laws on abortion, protection of the unmarried mother and the illegitimate child, prevention of sexually transmitted diseases, the removal of the economic factors that lead women into prostitution, promotion of a rational attitude towards sexually abnormal persons, which is, I think that means basically gay people, pretty much, and the reformation of the laws regarding sexual offences, which I think also references basically gay people and some activities they may be involved in publicly. Now, that is a summary of what progressive advocacy has been pursuing really since then. I mean, all of these, a lot of this, of course, this is all basically kind of done now. They've achieved all of these things. But that and what the point I'm making here is that this is where all this stuff kind of comes out of. It comes out of a certain paradigm. And over the coming articles, we're going to get into what that paradigm actually is. Now, this brings us to UNESCO. So we mentioned the Huxley family being close to the development of eugenics, which of course they are. And I'm not even saying that's a bad thing necessarily. I'm just pointing it out. It's just a fact. Now, Huxley, of course, was the first Director General of UNESCO. And and he was a noted eugenicist. He wrote a lot on eugenics, actually, and I mean, I haven't read all that he's read. I've read a number of things by Huxley, including this one, which is he wrote, when he became Director General of UNESCO, he wrote this book called the UNESCO, Its Purpose and Philosophy, which you can see there. And in that book, he basically says a number of interesting things, but basically he outlines that the philosophy he's kind of coming from is a form of scientific humanism. Now, scientific humanism is basically taking humanism and kind of finding scientific justifications for its principles, really, or finding a humanism that can be essentially scientifically proven, which really is just humanism developed. This is hugely important. So he was in the Malthusian League, he was in the Eugenics Society. His grandfather was the aforementioned T.H. Huxley, who had been known as Darwin's bulldog. And Huxley explained that book in 1947. That was UNESCO's philosophy. And, that was, UNESCO immediately put out statements on race and all this, which are notable. And Huxley probably wouldn't have been as radical as some of those people in some respects. He definitely wasn't a biological denialist by any means. He was a true eugenicist. But the crucial thing is he outlines in that book, and mainly in other writings, but he gets at it in that book, how I think I cite in the first essay, a little bit about some of the things he said, because he basically popularized the term transhumanism. And this speaks to the idea that transhumanism really just comes out of progressive ideology, and it comes out of evolutionary theory, it comes out of humanism, and it's the idea that Huxley basically argued that our evolution at this point, speaking in the mid-20th century, does not really have to rely upon purely biological means. That with these new programs of health and education and public, kind of eugenic type policies like that, that essentially, the mind, we're going to kickstart our evolution, and our evolution is going to accelerate, and we're going to become basically far better people, far better humans. And this is the idea, first of where transhumanism comes from, is that eventually we're going to move beyond the limitations of the current time. An interesting cat, for sure. Now, I'll talk more about that kind of stuff later, but where am I at here? Yeah, so in addition to Huxley, he's explaining how eugenics is shifting, how the new eugenics is going to be about, giving people artificial aids to improve their minds and to learn quicker, thereby quickening evolution. And this change in eugenics was found also in every other institution basically associated with it. Now, so this brings us to the Family Planning Association in Britain, and this was rebranded, right? So initially it was founded as the National Birth Control Council, and it was founded by this woman called Margaret Pike in 1930, and it was renamed as the National Birth Control Association, and then it became the Family Planning Association in 1939, around the time of the war, Second World War, and it collaborated with British eugenicists in establishing a series of women's health centres, which it was kind of rebranding the kind of eugenics into like women's health. Now, notably, there's also a progressive education link here, because her husband was a guy called Geoffrey Pike, and he ran this school called the Malting House. It was a progressive experimental school in Cambridge, and essentially they applied the theories of Maria Montessori, who was very important in the development of progressive education. We still have Montessori schools to this day. John Dewey, of course, we'll be talking a lot about him later on, who was the American pragmatist philosopher and one of the most important people in the development of progressive education in America in the late 19th and early 20th century. Basically everyone, even today actually, people still go back to Dewey. And of course Sigmund Freud. So Sigmund Freud basically represents this kind of second kind of wave of psychological kind of a psychological approach to education. And then later it becomes a new thing is developed called humanistic psychology. But basically, there was a head teacher there called Susan Isaacs, and she was a very famous progressive educator. And there's the picture on the right there is Margaret Pike, and on the left is Susan Isaacs. And so this really is just getting to the point that progressive education is inherently related to all of these developments. No matter what you kind of look at today, it's very easy to look at it today and we get confused. But once you go back into the literature, and I've cited some really good literature in this series, really good stuff actually I found, and you'll find it very useful to kind of clarify your thoughts better. So this brings us back to these development strategies. So we talked about how the progressives basically created these development strategies initially in the 50s. This is all premised upon the development of these ideas like public health. And so the concept of public health became foundational to development programs. And this is a quote from Fatal Misconception, which I just showed you earlier on, by Matthew Connolly. And he says, this is a really good quote actually, he says, "It would guide not only America's own efforts, but also UNICEF's campaign against tuberculosis." Now this is the concept of health, public health. So it would guide not only America's own efforts, but also UNICEF's campaign against tuberculosis, and the WHO's, the World Health Organization's, effort to eradicate malaria. In this way, what became known as development was conceived of as the triumph not merely of economics over politics and of man over nature, but of man over himself in an evolutionary process that was at least partly biological in nature. So the idea of public health is inherently linked to the concept of controlling your own evolution. And this is foundational to progressive ideology, and it's actually deeper than that. It's actually a kind of a modernism, an axiom of modernism in some respects. So the first development strategies, then you get groups like UNESCO, the UN Population Commission, John D. Rockefeller III's Population Council, which I think it was the group that really supported the creation of the first contraceptive, I'm sure, or one of them anyway, and its promotion. And of course this all led to the first American economic development strategies, such as the Point 4 program, which I think was under President Harry Truman, who nuked Japan. And it was all derived apparently from earlier Rockefeller Foundation programs, the core objectives being the creation of a global consumer culture and a modern worker. And of course the Ford Foundation, Rockefeller Foundation, USAID, these institutions still exist. They're still enormously powerful and influential, and in many respects these are the institutions which have kind of replaced, you know, the classical kind of institutions, the church, the authority of the church, etc. The church has basically almost become an NGO itself amongst all of this. The religious organizations, they've basically become NGO-fied. You had the emergence of Concern, Africa Concern in the after the Biafran civil war in 1969, I think that was. And so then they proliferate. And the thing is, the NGOs are operating in the institutional environment set up by these large foundations and governmental bodies, and of course in Ireland in the 70s we got our own foreign aid program under Gareth Fitzgerald, I think it was. You know, Ireland was in the OECD. We were kind of a star pupil in terms of how to kickstart economic development. That was what our education system was eventually kind of reconstructed as a result of the OECD. Now, these national development strategies emerge, and essentially Western aid is formalized as part of annual budgeting. So now everyone has to have, as to be a member of the OECD, and I think the UN mandates it too, you have to have a certain percentage of your GDP going to foreign aid. So now there's a whole economy has been constructed based on this paradigm, and we all pay into it. So it is notable that this creation of a global consumer culture, a modern worker, you know, it all goes along with this management of migration, this management of economics, this management of your attitudes, and then I think this brings you, and we're going to show through our analysis over this series of articles, how you get to areas like UNESCO talking about global citizenship education, UNESCO talking about things like SEL, social and emotional learning. Like that is essentially just more modern techniques to achieve this very thing. And so we're getting towards the end here now, and I'm going to make an argument here about NGOs, which I think a lot of people kind of instinctively pick up upon, which is that NGOs are often, not always, but often they are reliant upon this institutional system for legitimacy. So if I or you set up an NGO to do something, we would have to basically operate within this structure. So any of the NGOs operating in the development paradigm, in aid, they're all kind of involved in dealing with these larger institutions, and they have to kind of play ball. And a certain kind of person is attracted to this, and so this brings us to this kind of period in the 70s where there was this major loss of faith in governmental institutions. So this guy called Richard N. Gardner, who was of the Council on Foreign Relations, the Trilateral Commission, Columbia University. He was also a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford. And he basically explained that there was a need for a new approach in the April 1974 edition of Foreign Affairs magazine, which is the journal of the Council on Foreign Relations. And so this is an often cited article, and there's a reason for that, because in essence, basically, Gardner is telling you what the new paradigm is going to be. He basically lays out, because at this time, the Trilateral Commission had just been formed, and their opening kind of statement, or pretty much was, there's a crisis of democracy, which was a report that they wrote. I think Samuel Huntington was one of the people who wrote that. And they're basically saying that people have no faith in these democratic institutions. They have no real desire to kind of go into this kind of global government. All of these kinds of newly established nations in the developing world aren't really interested in creating a global government. And so we're going to have to recreate things from the ground up. We're going to have to come up with a new strategy in which we can make smaller incremental steps in more specialized areas, and we can kind of move where we want. And this is the role of NGOs. Civil society NGOs basically make all of this possible, and it is notable that, he was involved with constructing the sustainable development paradigm, which emerged officially after earlier periods in the 70s and 80s where they were kind of working towards sustainable development, like the Brundtland Commission, etc. But in 1992, the Rio Earth Summit, which was officially called the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development, it was held, and Gardner was advising, special advisor to the United Nations at Rio. So this is where you get UN Agenda 21 from. And then from that you get the Millennium Development Goals, and from that you get the Sustainable Development Goals, which include all of this educational material which we now talk about in terms of the RSC. Okay, and that can all be proven actually, and later we're going to do all of that. But Gardner was an important person, and this kind of it shows you kind of how you get to where you are and why things are the way they are. So to conclude the project, what have we learned basically? So modern education has its roots in Plato and the Enlightenment originally, although it just borrows pieces from Plato, really, aspects. It doesn't take his rigor, and it borrows some aspects of the Enlightenment, and then of course it borrows increasingly from idealism, utopianism, and then later the development of psychology, experimental psychology, and this kind of stuff. Basically, education then became a mechanism to construct an ideal society. This goes along with the creation of economic man, Homo economicus, if you prefer, and the rise of social control and social engineering. So the creation of a kind of an ideal society requires social engineering. And I use the term in a broader sense. Some people use the term social engineering in a very narrow sense, but social engineering is a great term to describe, so much of the progressive kind of program for society. It does involve attitudinal adjustment, and we've shown throughout this presentation kind of how some of this stuff came to be, some of the big picture. We've introduced it anyway. We're going to talk about it more in detail later. And so the utopian pursuit of world government was linked directly to modern education, particularly since the 19th and 20th century with the progressive education movement. And these ideas are now embedded in international institutions, which are the institutions administering largely the development of curricula all over the world, including in Ireland. So the UN has direct influence through its instruments in directing the development of curricula in this country. And over the coming series of articles, we're going to get to there. We're going to lay all this out, and I'll get to more specific information as that kind of goes on. But for now, I think we'll leave it there. So just to go back to the main screen here, that was the opening salvo in this project, basically. And if you like this material, if you know people who would be interested in this, so if you know people who are very worried about what's going on with either RSC, SPHE, or just education in general, what's happening with radicalism in universities or whatever it is, maybe send them this on, or suggest some of this material to them, even some of the essays. You can find my Substack in the description to this video. You can see a list of social media accounts that I've just created in the last month or so to launch this new project, basically. And I'll be uploading another installment in a week or so, and then I'll do a video for that. And so for each installment we're going to do a video, basically, and I'll kind of talk through the ideas and concepts in that format. A lot of people don't want to read like a 5,000 word essay, I understand, but the essay has a lot more reference material in it. So even if you just want to listen to me talk through this material, I would recommend you just even have a glance at some of the material in there. Have a look at the references. You'll find interesting material to dive into. Everything is referenced. My social media is listed. I have a Twitter account. I'm not going to promise I'm going to use Twitter very much. And of course, I've created an Odyssey channel. I have a Rumble. I haven't got anything on that yet. And I've created the Substack, which is the receipts.substack. That's where all the writing is going to be up there. So I would invite you to peruse that article, and I'll be back very soon. I hope to see you in the next installment. So take care, and I'll see you soon.